Hello, everyone. It's me, Michael, and this is Bore Me to Sleep, the series dedicated to helping people sleep. More specifically, this video will lull you to sleep by boring you with unintelligible nonsense. For this episode, I'll be using vocabulary and sentence structure that vaguely emulates a reading on the principle of relativity by Albert Einstein and Hermann Minkowski. I've used machine learning to generate a monologue that doesn't make much sense in order to provide you the same comfort as falling asleep in a lecture. Please don't try to understand the script. Many people enjoy falling asleep to videos like this, but some can't as the material is too interesting. The words I say will vaguely pertain to the subject, but will be fragmented enough where a meaning can't be found. The effect created is a boring lecture where you can't understand or pay attention, even if you wanted to. Therefore, I suggest you get comfortable and try to sleep. Let the words wash over you and let your mind drift. If this video helps you do that, please consider supporting. Liking, sharing, and subscribing help these episodes reach other people that need them. By the way, Bore Me to Sleep is ever evolving, and I'm continuing to dial in my delivery, cadence, and overall sound. I try to make myself sound boring in these episodes, so let me know what you think. Ultimately, this project is for you, so your feedback is hugely appreciated and will be used for continuous improvement. Also, for those who enjoy a little extra ambiance, episodes are uploaded alongside an alternate version with added background music. Some people find soft music or atmospheric sounds help them relax even more, so that option will be available. I will now begin the lecture, so please enjoy and sleep well. If in the principle of our theory the physical laws of matter and proved as a special relativity holds as theory of the matter, he is a host of the second theory vectors and first given of the Maxwell-Lorentz in general relativity theory. The generalized relativity principle by the means of relativity and the fundamental equations, if a relativity postulate, we can always call a definite principle which are quite independent of cases of con. The same can be transformed to these equations. The second of equations hold. The second, as we can easily show the principle of A, is that the right-hand side of the vector axis is in 4 vectors. It is at rest with a respect time of P, and it is always at the same first approximation. It signifies that which led us to call the tensor of the second rank, the special significance of tensor. With negative v, if we consider that epsilon equals Ea and m in the direction of the space-time points, that E is equal to the velocity minus v, and at P, which is at u, m minus E, and minus n, we can see that the z-axis, but space-time vectors n is a space, time vector of the second kind, from which the expression we obtain. When 0 becomes equivalent to negative, by E, epsilon phi are the vectors of time and space, and f is to the vector space vector of the first kind. If phi by the sixth vector of the two vectors is the following, we can look upon the special Lorentz transformation in the acceleration way of matter, the general laws of nature, physical laws of space and time in kind, as they are the same as the equations of the electron in a material point. The other axis may be a fundamental distinction at the time concept, which is at rest in the stationary system, keeping v with a point on the electron and the same proportion as a definite connection may be given to c. We shall denote the time which passes through the x-Newtonian continuum, xa. Let we have a magnetic force vector by the first kind, x, y, and b. We have phi sub 4 equals 0 and the last matrix 1 equals 1 not to the condition of 4k. This can be expressed by 1, 1 in the equation, x, n are the normal components of the first kind, as the system of equations. 10 are now multiplied by the letter 1 according to the angle f and 0. The equation is obtained only in the sense the energy of the light minus complex measured in the system k is equal to their motion. Let the rods be synchronous clocks in the figure of Lorentz S. We see that the general of light is not without involving the relative one, and the prism, or by moving bodies, is proportional to a series in which the spatial system of the row of matter. The observer relative to k prime would be a fundamental distinction in any application of the velocity of light, is given as it is. The stationary system, the fourth we obtain the magnetic rest minus force. The velocity of light is the velocity of light, and we see that in a free space-time region A, measured in the system of k prime, the fundamental idea of this condition is to be, in a method of writing it, then this conception is that the 4 of vector f with the velocity vector of the hyperboloidal e negative, psi with the normal time of the filaments, then a vector with the p times 4 series matrix, whose elements are taken from a 4 times 4 determinant, where s minus s sub 11 negative s sub 12 times s sub 13. If we have a few important simplifications which follow from the equations, a definite connection, we obtain a kinetic energy of matter. In consequence of Einstein planned in the second principle, we can call the first method a space minus the independence of the same space, and time itself stands still, but by means of the very success of the velocity, it is that the electric and the rest is defined to be at rest, and hence then y is equal to v of beta, x, y, beta, and c minus u squared. If we consider, according to the second axiom of the substitution in the consequence, that the energy of law can be obtained by the law of all movements, we shall now see that the world is equal to infinite matter. We must be in the effect, but all the case of the usual mechanics. It follows that the equations of S sub 1 and the dielectric space measured in generalized matter, a uniformly relative motion for a space-time line, we ascribe to the principles of time and space. Then, a definite basis of the second group of transformations, see the equations we obtained with k equals 0, the second member of the simple rotation of the equations, which are transformed into the equations n with dx eta. Then according to E, Y, and X, the electric inductance E equals m, the electric current, and the magnitude induction of phi. The magnetic force N is the magnetic force, with space minus direction, if the time minus t minus points, and which is independent of the orientation of the local distribution of matter. The relativity postulate on other must be the elastic solid ether, but he introduced the clock defined in the same way as the Minkowski. It can also be expressed by the matrix of mu, or will show that the choice of the 4 vectors psi, a, mu, in the case of the A equation is equal to 0, in the form of the case, i.e., the vector u equals 0, and we have at every space-time vector of the m alone. We have to the following all relations, for the first 2 vectors are of matter, the equations and the equations of motion of 10, and we add that the second of equations of I, on the special relativity considered is a rotation of the excess motion. By the motion of matter, the observer in the moving rigid manner is a ray of light p and k prime. We can be a body of r sub 0, which at last relatively at rest in the system of k. We can establish the equations of motion in the material point. The mathematical conception of the brand new obtained in the new equations of a 4-dimensional parallelepiped, with reference as a function of the magnetic field, we can establish some choice of gravitational function of the electron. When we are the last axis in a symmetrical system of motion, for the point we have introduced in the system of this component, then the equation of motion of energy measured in the second are not only to each other, the body's s sub 1 and is normal to the apparatus of the second of the s orbit. Then by the 6 magnitudes omega sub 0, omega sub 1, omega sub 2, omega sub 3 is equal to omega sub 4. Then the velocity vector of the material point of the second kind w, then the system of the equations and section 3, and in addition to the dielectric found in the change of the axes, the velocity of light relative to the light in the hyperwork of the stationary system. The apparatus of magnetic processes without the moving bodies, and k prime is multiplied by a linear transformation. X on a vector is equal to mass minus of the electric force and phi. If the quantity energy components of the magnetic force we finally obtain from the form 12 to the system S equation are not of the form of the energy axis, from any 2 spaces will be in the case. It can also be shown that the choice of the fundamental equations, transformation for that we can at every place of the clock, but that this is deduced and cannot be represented by the equation 1 minus u squared, and in the second, the relation x prime and e comma m, which are known but are all in their consequences will come out of the form of the expression. For the square of the expression on account of x, we have the system of the motion of a straight line. This expression is to be defined by the same form as the expression, with the fourth, the components of the second member on the right-hand side, which is a magnetic force, placed on the stationary system therefore. A current which is given by the original equations Then the energy law is given by the definite and volume in the question of motion, such that the equation of energy can always be caused to the surface of the moving system. As it is to be A, the transformation of all energy of the plane B is equal to infinity. For a point moving charge on the velocity of light, the relative motion on the rod of the stationary system round the velocity of light. Now we can look upon the following way with the acceleration, as vector u is at rest. The vector psi is equal to j brackets 1 minus u squared. In the case, in place of the equations E and x, the energy of law, let us have the infinitely small plane as a function of the electron. T, as such an observer, the result of the physical laws of the transformations. A rigid force and time according to the usual conception that the velocity of the light complex. The tensor of matter cannot be a Lorentz in the case. Laws of a way of the sense have a certain transformation given by the four components of R, and the first all zero, and we obtain as the rest minus ray. If we now by the following axiom, as if let us denote it by the time t, the third body can be taken as if t prime, the b and c negative, and another system of S minus system. And in our problem, we also have at first sight every space-time filament. The fundamental equations for the transformation is, as we obtained, the equation becomes in our form, the equations and referring back to the vectors. On the components of the second kind, remembering with A is equal to n plus 1 minus w, which can be of the Maxwell value, it is to be replaced by the equation 10 and the equation leading to 1. Lorentz can be further represented by a function of epsilon rho equals 0. From all, let us have the vector of the first type, i.e., when we have phi as the components of the vector in which the second system of equations. We can thus find the clock considered from the axis A will be B, which is greater than sufficient, and we would substitute the current moving systems R. In the case of a Lorentz transformation A, since this velocity of light c relative to k, the velocity of the light is completely relative to the velocity of numerical possible. If we now write of the space-time vector of the first kind, m, negative IE, and the magnetic vectors sigma f equals 0, with the equation of the equation 1 R naught can be seen as E prime. The theory has given in motion of this manner. Let us now consider the first of the second group of the gravitational field, which is known of magnitude through space. The time point on which there is a point, the stationary system of the Earth relative to the ether, on the other theory must be carefully in the case of the special relativity theory. We have seen that this solution which are chosen in the case of H, 1, 3, 4, and 4, if the case of V we have the system in which the case of the second term will be arbitrarily chosen. But it is clear that all physical laws according to physical conditions are merely simple, and are observed of facts the sufficient to Fresnel, giving a satisfactory explanation on the relativity principle. This amounts to the field equations we obtained in the components of x prime and the equations of x. We shall now introduce the system as U, the total electric system, holding for systems K as required by the Lorentz expressions for our choices of axis. We obtain a three-dimensional surface of the space-time point in the direction. We have the general conceptions about this operation and will call this postulate a special relativity. But physical laws according with the laws of motion bodies in any matter. Seen the prospect that the fields of equations for besides the electron moves relative to k prime, at least for a system is a definite curve, for which is at rest, in other words the space-time point as functions of gravitational fields, and hence physical space. Let us consider the same order to make any way, in that the electric field from free space-time to the velocity of light old. We can thus look upon the laws of formation tensors. Negative rho times mu times rho is equal to 1 over the fraction of cos x. The equation, therefore, in the general case, h minus negative m, then by a means of light, minus 4 can be expressed in the form of b, 1 to the 4. V is any arbitrarily chosen 4 vector and a tensor, and following the expressions are following the way that any law of conservation in such small materials. The required delta that we find in the system of equations is relative to 3 of the equation. A system in which R is may regarded as the square root of u minus u, we introduce the final expression z, x, and the volume of the point even on the plane and space. Like in its position, we obtain the system of N, F, and the magnitude of V the same. The electric rest current, sigma mu minus 1, is equal to 0, and then fixing according to the system of motion. We also show that the system of a certain rod in which its physical laws are independent of actual velocity. According to the well-known theorem, the special relativity is a spacetime vector of the first kind. The geometrical significance can thus be brought out. We've seen that the general laws of attraction of this new theory, relativity, we get from the same 4, or F times rho over t, the sum of these two space and time from B in consequence of the second. We obtain the energy of the equations in a system of motion of the gravitational field. We get in the following way, negative h from the equations we obtained. And referring all the special Lorentz theory, in which we have already been into kinetic energy by matter and the ultimate ground for the magnetic field of matter, the stationary system considered to be a moving force of axes. This point has the observed nothing can be formulated in the following way. At once follows from the two vectors, by P, 0, C, F, is a space-time vector of the first kind. The geometrical importance here may be for the sake of A, alpha, the equation of C prime on the right-hand side. We can have that the dual matrix of A for the multiple of the series of line of A in magnetic fields, I by the spacetime vector of the first kind W with the components. 8 and 12 are covariant equals. We can put the last tau of the field, then the equation of our theory must lead to be put in the following manner. We have to take the two vectors in the motion of the Earth. If in a stationary system, the expression of the geodetic line 4, we get with reference to the indices mu and rho inner multiplication of sigma. Tau in this law we obtain the system and the motion of synchronism as regards with the reference system k. If the clock we have found the equations of the electron 3 in order to arrive at the first sight, the generalized relativity principle. This new principle had been based on a series of axes. We find the kind spacetime vectors of the first kind. The observed basis for moving force. If not is at rest, the moving system by the electrical charge may be observed into a more striking in time, and if on the plane of the velocity axis will correspond to a field. It is always to be seen in that the following problem of conservation of nature are in space, some one another, by the manner in which you have the process of a point M and the relation E. Then referring back to the same time tau and the same surface of delta, the length of the light complex measured in the system K, and is thus a length in which the square root of the convection coefficient equals to the same series of a cross line of I. The equation becomes equivalent to the picture. Now for the sake of A prime we can write tau x, y, z, and 1. It is the time of the transformation of the piece of the plane which we have the following important approximation. In the following three-dimensional notation, of these circumstances are called an element of the last three. If the time point of the journeys was so the clock B may be at any measuring rod, if a rod, and then we shall suppose that the system's equations of a straight one. If for a free space time point, we introduce in the following way. In our sense, we are to obtain the following combinations. 1, 2, and 3 are the expressed and magnetic equations, and at rest with the moving system K and the axis. We do not at rest but in the moment uniform motion in a straight direction. An electromotive force acts upon it, the velocity of the material decade of the Earth, but in the special theory of relativity. Let us now ask how far spacetime is usually propagated through time. 1 not at the same h all the way, and the velocity we have is equal to p plus 1 plus 1. Let us turn the Lorentz transformation away similar. We ask on the first of consistency of light and further looking for moving. A theory of this equipment, the experiment was with high velocity as wholly electrical, as the light will be defined in the wave effect of the addition of magnitude, and the same stationary. We have to do this with relation to the formulation of the second term. The expression for both the right-hand side of n, f sub 31 is equal to 0, which is accomplished by Minkowski A4. A vector with 6 vectors now from the other hand of the equation and are equal to 1 and negative 1. The system of equations for the system K only if the case is any second part of f, or of x 6 omega. In the case the energy in which is exerted by the same rod, defined by the same meaning. The Einsteinian basis of the equations of motion of the material point, from which we see that the first kind of the following equations assumed. The transformation of the equations and the equations are calculated. First, the member of the following terms, According to the law of equations, it follows from the above. A ray of light moves in the field, the magnetic field. In other, we have to do with the relations between the magnitudes of the second term. The laws of conservation in x prime as the function of d of mu, or outer multiplication of equal 4 times 4 and fix negative c, m, and e, which are always in the system of k, if then the moment of v transform the same result of the energy m, the system round the null point. We can get a certain law of the energy of the gravitational field expression. Should Lorentz transform to be regarded as the well of the kinetic energy of the cross-section of the Earth, but no such a theory in the fact already made, we have the following equations. The triumphs of the equations of a gravitational field we get from the equations of energy. Equivalent and referring back to the time given in the new tensor, in its directions, let there any direction and relation be. This can be made between the equations and the acceleration and the invariant for the second system of the volume. We get in the following way: h and 3, from which we have to take into account of those laws of the tensor. It lets always be fully equivalent to a point relatively at rest, and is a length, and the observer to be set of the same time, as a transformation of certain rules of the last term to be a general principle, which is at rest in the clocks of matter, are of the same as well as the results. So the phenomena of light, but as there was first offered by Einstein, it's clear that from either the physicists of an electric effect of Fresnel only with the velocity of k, if the time gravitational field our expression means by the Maxwell equations, we are now to introduce the relation. This shall denote any point 1 on the first kind, the velocity of matter of the same point 4. The three axes are all magnitudes, z and the electron u. Therefore, the velocity of v relative to the system k, which are not in the magnetic field. These three masses are at rest. Let us now arrive this quantity at the Newtonian point of s sub 1, and the velocity of light in the direction of f in the direction of u. The vector, the second rank is defined in the transformation law. This can thus be replaced by the formula 1, negative 1, as by the stationary system. We are two clocks in any manner. In order to not only be of two observed facts, it would also seem that such a Newtonian mechanic, in this introduction of the following law, when there are sufficient for the uniform distance, rho v is equal to 0, and let us now conceive of transformation A in space-time points, S the same form being independent of the equations, we can find if the first equations of equations. We obtain the expression I, only the indices, which the required equation is to be at rest in the following manner. For the two vectors a space in S sub 2 which are now in case, if we may denote the time 1 for as functions of the moving system, the reference to be given in the field equations, or the energy tensor of the gravitational field, I will now be of a function of b plus f, cos phi fractional of partial x. The electric induction multiplied by the measure at a point transformation to pc, Lorentz has found out the system of k. The physical phenomena does not always have to be seen. They denote the contravariant tensor of the second rank, so that we can only define the vector x prime as x mu the electric force, in the direction of motion. If r, y, and z are tau and a magnetic field, we have to introduce the following way. The three axes now then t, the equations also now s. Thus, special Lorentz S theory are approximately possible without any possibilities. In Lorentz assumption, we have his new theory of relativity. The space-time point on the right hand of the fourth equation of the components mu plus mu, the equation becomes equal to the equation so that it's easy to show the magnetic field together. There is a space-time xy, which is equal to negative beta, and the values of 10. V and Vs are to each other the z-axis. The product will appear and be the same as the time as well. Every spatial as those in the gravitational forces is postulated to be carried away by a measuring rod. This ray of light in the electrical masses of a Lorentz transformation, only for the velocity vector of the second kind. If we call it tau, then we can also call this transformation the mass point of a vector, as measured in the system S stationary bodies by means of 1. If this equation, we can always be following the law, as settled, once seen, however, a value in which indeed a clear geometrical meaning of space, like imaginary. The last world appears at the star of 2 points. Let the observed half, a world lined by a point, now for the case of a special type vector. if immediately there is the same to be taken of the following problem of a single general theory of relativity, the theory of electrons with this easily quite similar to that of the principle of relativity, the transformation from the special relativity theory, the relativity postulate from the space-time point K, which cannot be shown according to these bodies, it is found that the fundamental equations independent can be merely done. In the introduction of the theory of motion, we find that the second member is just the expression for the impulse. The electric force ρs are independent of equations, which transform into the same form as follows, where J has the space-time lines from the two material points A and space-time are the vector, if the observer being sent to the right-hand side, and 1 is therefore the equation for propagation. The equations are the established a certain physical law according to the relativity theory. The principle leads us to being of the symmetrical tensors of the tensors B, data for the indices, and the components of the third type D and 2, the condition divided by 4 as well as the corresponding to 1. Conceptions about this theory as theorems must be observed results. For finding out of the fact that the light complex measured in the stationary system in E prime, the electric and magnetic induction by means of the time of the expression for the bodies. This signifies that we obtain as a tensor for the first rank where there is a given, which is at rest of the introduction A, the rate at which to be due to the single usual suspect. The general principle, which assumption of the special relativity theory, must be a theory of a new theory of relativity. According to Hertz-Einstein, this is true for the choice of vector b, mu, and the right-hand side of the equation becomes as follows. I plus psi is E plus U of m minus omega, F and m, negative E, Y, beta, and E. And from the system of X, we see that we introduce the fields of section 7, at rest in the same way. In order to these three axioms, omega and psi, we now introduce the vector of the first type. Now any kind, the equations are negative j is equal to b plus omega n is equal to tau, which is equal to 0 in section 9. And every value of the time vector there is a point negative q and q from the velocity c. The velocity of the dielectric of stationary bodies while the source is given, synchronous with sufficient approximation for the velocity of light with respect to the system values of b. In a plane we have to obtain similar systems of the equation of the gravitation, which can be put as ρ. Rho divided by c will be a measure, and the vector omega with the transformation of x, y, z, and it, which is that the magnitudes of the function of the convection field. It is the same as the required at all present. This defines a current in the electron, which is a relative motion of ether with the velocity of light propagation. Source relative to the charge of moving bodies, but no fundamental distinction is made sufficient to A, and consistent ether theory in the application of the theory of electrons. This has the same relations held, and in case has been satisfied for the laws of nature. The disorder and the vector in the form of 10, 11, and 12 are also linear transformations with the determinant plus 1, so that only the theorem law as the results of the equations are obtained from the introduction of any. How we obtain a contravariant 4 vector is the second type. F of the special relativity theory to the limiting case of the laws of gravitation does not show that it is clear in the surface of physical spacetime in the material point. Its space cannot be made as observed impulse and magnetic, and the same length of the second axis. There is a linear which should be of the field standpoint of the form of force, plane, psi, and the negative s product of a kind. The time in which we are into the force acting upon which has a hypothesis about the Einstein, which was defined in this principle must be the case. We therefore have to put x prime, which is comprised of 1, d, u, and not by m. The mode of motion, which we have seen in the first of two operations, will be called a time in the stationary system. According to the second, these equations for the equations of motion in the material point, we can put as the second other ranks which can be generalized in the sense of the theory of the relativity postulate. Lorentz established on the account of an electron theory, the fundamental equations must be given by the referred to of matter as far as a magnetic force of light, matter in moving magnetic field K. The physical significance is taken to be seen by the restricted postulate. Hence, in the general relativity theory, relativity postulate leads us to a further. Laws in order to make the following way shown that have in any other relation of our chosen transformation, electrodynamics for the velocity axis. We therefore have the following relations in our theory. which are concerned with the clocks synchronous in the second point of the system reference to be given, in the following way. When the j-axis we obtained is the following law. On the other hand, we have to take the small psi, comprised of x, y, and zeta, equal to the negative system, which is also equal to 0, i.e. at the same time vector m is equal to m, x, y are equal to z, which is also equal to psi brackets x minus u squared. D multiplied by y minus negative sigma, now by e, show that the time vector of the second kind are of a spacetime vector of the first kind. This is normal to BC. Not only is it normal, they are also comprised of the special relativity theory in the electrodynamics of moving bodies. The region considered from the clocks can be defined as the cross-section of QQ in the strip belonging strip. We shall have to normal the rest and space negative, n being the velocity of the moving rod, then in the stationary station, always remain practically by the surface. In terms of relativity, the addition of negative assumptions appear results, this giving the new case of epsilon v, or not called k. Let measure 2 and 4, the component of energy components of matter. The transformation at 4 negative vector with the density given by c, since the velocity of matter we have the same time of time axes. Now, let us suppose that the magnitude of x-axis will be understood as space-time vector. If the force vector of the hyperboloidal psi and I w sub 4, the space-time vectors of the first kind, i.e., the velocity of light is independent of the new theory of physical laws, it would be proved to show how the account of nature in this reality is of relativity postulate. But meanwhile, enunciation of the principle in a rigid manner does not signify of the system's motion and the manner and uniform direction. If we now take the time axis, the time tau is considered. We have now taken the special transformation of the field which are not of the same time as their line and ponderable masses. As our measuring rod, we are now into the following transformation law. The tensor of a zero and rank is defined by 16 and d plus sigma n, and introduced for the axis of time. We have the same length as the electric and magnetic forces being observed in a manner that in the other hand upon the energy hand side of the first leads of the equation of the simple form of the motion of manner, the other hand of the second term on the continuum, but such of the one field equations is a significant approximation, for the ray of light is to the origin of. Let us now be the length of the electron or the auxiliary equations. Physicists, which are not necessary to be seen out of the general relativity space, equations defined by the curvature of rest in the principal line chosen. But if we introduce the 4-vector LORA, if S is equal to 1 and 1 is equal to the equation, it appears that k holding the system k equals 1, 2, and the direction of the tangents e, beta, mu, and b. If c is equal to 0, we have the following from negative 1 minus u squared, and referring back to the equations are only for the same form of the equation and the moving bodies. In the case of the expression on the right hand, the second term of the expression 1, which will be shown by the electrical masses, the less iconoclastic in a rigid manner may be transformed to a point in the second kind, xy, and be d minus m minus u minus omega m psi plus a 4 vector. They call E in z, and the velocity of the electric magnetic field obtained by the following relations. The equations of our 10 divided by sigma t, we can have the following relation. Negative d plus d cos I psi plus 2 brackets 1 minus u squared, 1 minus 1, which will be shown by the c remains. We see that the first energy of the relativity postulate in order to do with the special relativity theory in electrodynamics of moving bodies. On the Maxwell-Lorentz transformation, Lorentz Einstein is given to be modified 3. The cross-section of the space of one of the times of a fixed ether, there is a river ether aberration depending on the velocity of light itself. It is always to see that the general laws of gravitation axes. The space-time vector of the first kind is the geometrical. I may be called the vector product of the vector. Further, let us take the place of energy components of the second electron. An expression can be called a sufficient approximation of the differential combination of the same as upper boundary as the functions of vector in the gravitational field. The curvature of energy vectors have upon the equations 1 and b, 3, the expressions of the equation of a form A. 2 in consequence of 4, we get the 4x4 series matrix. In the part of AIOR, a space-time vector of the first kind to be the proper time vector of the first. The system of light, the velocity of light. Let us transform of the third axiom of the components of the two vectors which are of the system, which have the uniform motion of motion. This is then the experience of a special relativity theory given us by a quantity of the surface K, namely a perpendicular direction and force of the law are given for the sufficience from the law of the calculus. This is taken in the case so that the components of the vector of mu is transformed into a 4 and time difference in the direction of the energy. As the Lorentz transformation at B will be a fundamental condition, suppose that the light clock which is laid in the stationary system by a relativity theory, then we obtain the curvature as the kinetic energy of the material point. Gravitational forces where there is a motion in line which is at rest, we see that the appearance of the gravitational field will be defined as the stationary system. An invariant given in the geodetic line, the radius vector OA prime being the light vectors of the 6 magnetic field. In these we do have to write that tau minus u comma e is in the spacetime vector, which takes the place in space and measured in the stationary system. The physical significance of the equations of motion of the observer, if a definite time being set of the manner are characterized by the Newtonian point, the unit measuring rod, then for the system of x, y, zeta are every spacetime vector of the second kind. M in the equations are conceived of the full indices mu, and second member can be a third member in the equation. A 4 vector by any case we shall see with forms. The second member in 10 only in the form of the energy 4x4 are constants epsilon and omega. F as an I in the electric with the magnetic force acting upon the electron. It must be a uniform rectilinear motion which is one of the electrical transformations. He can now be represented by two operations as the Lorentz transformation. We can always to see with the world postulate which is clear about a finite which has been for a transformation. We have K as the new equations are those in the same of those system equations. The electron moves, thus always, for more of a limit. We can only form according to every special case that it's true upon the choice of reference. Time from which are cases of gravitation, I the principle of the filament of FF. From the following acts upon the laws of moving transformations. Let us now picture ourselves from the 2 points of view. Let us consider the motion rigid body, which according to be at rest will always be equivalent to the system of S. It is to this idea that the approximation that the gravitational field in matter is again curvature space, i.e. P and M. To these 3 equations, we thus can have the following relation, which is equal to 0. The system of equations x and y. The velocity c in such a unit of volume is the line joining the 3 masses of systems, and we have taken into account those relations for the relation which are referred to the relative motion of matter. It follows that this covariance comes out of the 4th equation. Thus the 4th from the second theory when considered from the moving system, and we are at the rest, after charging moving bodies while at the rest regards the world's line. The line of passing through 2 points, the principle of the line of space, time, or in the case we can write the square root of 1, a vector which is parallel from the space-time continuum x, y, and negative z, shows that the electric induction by M and induction so. Only this vector and the clock that has B is unreal. Let us suppose that the clock at B and the one at a second in B is 0 in a space and nu system. We obtain the equations of space and magnetic bodies at rest. We shall introduce the system of equations in the following way when the components of a tensor and the second member on the other hand of the right-hand side. If we now introduce in the space-time point considered to the time point x and m in a system in which it is stationary in the Lorentz transformation, let us conceive of the radius of vector IOR, LF is equal to 0, and Lorentz's theory holds for the relation K denotes that the magnetic force acting upon it is easy to define. A vector in the direction of the unit of surface is now by 1. Let the length of the unit rod we obtained in that electrical space, time pointing 0, the resting ray. It's necessarily the velocity negative c and the velocity v which moves the velocity. The second we obtain by referring back to first. The clock at B is to be estimated. At the result are not to be at rest and therefore adopting the system K with a constant velocity. If we now introduce a system of the equation in section 3 in the equation of motion of the point, the equation in section 3 in the equation of motion of the point, we obtain the stationary system at p equals 1. Then when the time required to be by the same time he introduces the present section appears. We have to introduce a system in the space system, at any point system chosen, and therefore, then the system of values to the events occurring, in which its total appearance of the point time any two points are given to the same rod, the position x prime and y prime, we obtain that tau is equal to 1 minus u squared. The general vectors are obtained by the form of the impression. Therefore, the determinant v is an expression arising from the form at once follows. From the 78, we have the following from the law of motion in the material point on a new system. In a manner, we can put the following example. Since the electrical masses b prime which are let to be rest in the system is to be expressed in the axis of matter, the law of relativity is very connected with the Newtonian. The theory without any velocity of light is the optical point of its velocity. It's time to let us call the vector of the first kind with components of the two w. The moving system is defined by a measuring rod as negative y, and in the section 4 we can as general laws of impulse energy on the right hand side of the equation rho is equal 4, and from it following the components of x prime, epsilon, psi, we introduce in the new way a tensor, fractional divided by partial of x, which we have as a function tending to be the equations of the differential equations 10 multiplied by 11 or 12, or it's required to be the case similar to sigma as the functions of the stationary system. If we now introduce the original system in the case of motion of the A ray light moving with a reference of A mass and Q a point, and the velocity of a ray of light we shall call the magnetic force. It's the velocity of light in a free space-time point f, or a velocity of time-space points, which are not required by Lorentz's theory in a true in order. The principle of relativity must be in the case of a finite region. If we now in fact have the equations of the electron which have the magnetic resting force F, behaving like the vector magnetic force, the first kind if then the equation of light energy are synchronous, then the placed moves in a vacant space, and time u in no other purpose does not possible to be. It will be shown that this covariance of physical significance of gravitation, we see that of the choice of the two differential equations of the transformation 2, 3 for B of section 3, the second theory of equations for all systems which are synchronous in the system, and are possible to the total energy line. The expression of a sixth vector is thus any vector of spacetime vector in the first kind with the components R of the matrix and P we obtain 4x4 series matrix. When the determinant of S plus A 4x4 series matrix of a product and negative C product were obtained in a system wave transformation, we have the following equation. If we obtained the general energy ray of matter, i.e. the motion of the material point of the continuum, is to be so that the first body of the continuum of 4 occurring with a freely moving object, the system for moving bodies in clocks are rest relative to the moving system and is capable of second expression to the other differential quotients, which the condition of the equations is changed into the consideration of the transformation. We have a tensor, the quantities of this tensor. The two 4 vectors are synchronous with the velocity of light in the system of reference, which are they covariant for the case of the same space, and their relative motion which can be the same, at rest in the equation of any manner. If we now put the right hand in 3, we get this condition, as obtained in the first approximation of the components of Newtonian with the Lorentz transformation. We are the velocity in the direction of the unit plane, negative z in equations, with C the moving system which are set in the same completely possible to the negative results. It is that the electromagnetic effect of the light between actual medium is quite independent of the medium, but the principle was quite different descriptions of the matter, the electron, only out of the time k, which the plane can be at rest in y and tau. The system of the gravitation field is thus defined in these quantities. The following treatment are light vectors and the vector at every space-time vector u of the first kind, w, the matrix B, f, the fractional partial equation of x, in the way of the other which we make to our equations, when we require that the first nothing can be compensation due to the physical laws. It's also shown that the covariance of the 4 coincidences are therefore to both the quantities are all components of the 4 vector. If we see that the summation, for example, then the field vector is the covariant 4 vector. If x, y, and z is equal to 0, the form of the parallelogram bounded by the 4 vector u is 0. We have to write the proper time vector of the first kind w, the geometric induction by the second 4, the matrix of the elements omega sub 1, or 0, omega sub 3, is radius 4. The second member, the round bracket, vanishes. We can easily see that the reference of the field are constant values of matter. We have the same time from the equations now for the special relativity theory. It can be shown that the first theory of the acceleration of light velocity of vector, the material point of moving bodies in the stationary system K, if we now introduce as the equations of the electron, must also be when the position of the moving rod of the stationary system, if we have to the general, in this case of these cases, will in the case of the special relativity theory. The components of the second electron we have to take as the same those of laws. It follows that they are independent of the nature of moving systems of moving bodies. If the stationary system is considered by a clock, which is at rest in a stationary system, he is in a world point P where the product of the rod is components of the 4 vectors in the direction of t. Adding LOR shall reduce to a few more from the equations or the second member of the expression A of f. This is normal to omega when subjected to be the one moving. Its material point in 1, 3 can always be written as the second upon the expressed in the form b and 12 are to the formula. We have the first result of the following manner, but when it has shown that in the solution the invariant of ρ is equal to 0, only the equation determinant 3, a, and IE is a transformation of the first. The unit of plane upon the null point P, such as A, is not only to be the velocity of the upper normal of the platform A. The light without the observed effect more than the ether in the medium has been made to the case of the special Lorentz theory. For any space-time point considered, there is no time that a moving system, which we may call this a system in the above system of motion. We see that the clock at 4 vector of the second kind. We can easily see that this equation, which is assumed here, is equivalent to a postulate. It quite simply is the physical laws of Maxwell-Lorentz transformation. Not only the third time of the same law, but for this special theory is a case of a special relativity theory, which is obtained by the laws of nature in this scene. The following law holds the case of a 4 vector. For example, we introduce as one new symmetrical tensor of the second rank. We have to prove according to the world point corresponding to the system of, that we see the transformation of the equations in a sense. When referred to the system of x and y, which is transformed to this equation, it can be expressed in the following way. -1 so that when they are necessary to the magnetic field, they are the most fundamental distinction and it's true in a restricted field. But it's only gotten here by this covariance as the energy tensor of the gravitational field. We can thus look upon the problem for any tensor of all type. Our 4 vectors at the first part of LOR are I and F. Let us draw the tangent, these of the mass. We now call E equals to 1 plus mu rho is equal to z sub 0 and E cos E. If we show that Q is an invariant expression as tensors, the space vector UB is equal to psi, which is the electrical rest density of phi. If m minus u and E brackets m equals minus at the vector velocity of electricity, this is therefore the physical principle of the motion in a series of the same type. Now we see that in fact the following way is equal to -a times rho is equal to I, or it is to be noticed that the last common of the b space-time point x is 0. Then the equation takes the simple form 10, 11, and 12. With the Lorentz transformation, a finite system of reference is given by saying that the energy of components of the matter is gravitational. I have in the form of A, H, and B is replaced by A prime, and the rule of the equation is obtained. The equation of the integral of s, multiplied by s, y, and the root of -1, which can be written in the equation b equals 0, we can have the following important notice, which is the following or the law of a group of light in the material point of gravitational matter. The field will be shown. The causing theory of the tensor of the second rank is defined. Through and though we only have the new equations, which the equations of light obtained in the equations for obtained. This becomes equivalent to the system according to the equations that can be found by the measuring rod for itself. But one the such special laws of formation of the relativity postulate. Thus, it is this confirmation that shows any physical laws are perceived to be almost too whole. It would be seen over the whole measurement. He deduced the definite field which is propagated in the stationary system K, the help of motion of the second point B. We introduce the above vector of the first kind, m, (-e), m. The vector, whose vector is represented by the contents of a 4 determinant, x, beta times x, volume of the electric force d prime. The velocity vector of the first kind, if b equals 0, is obtained in the following relations. 1 are expressed in the new choice of mu, beta, rho, and beta. In order to prove the definition of a world field at any point in time, this leads us to be that it is not possible to the velocity of light space coordinates by the time of the second kind of the expression, I, so that the form of the form can be the expression of f, or the equation xn plus x times zeta and phi, the tau equals 0 at the function of xy with the partial derivative over a fraction of cos x multiplied by sine, which are independent of the orientation of the gravitational field on matter. The expression is satisfied to be put as I, or the system of light measured in the stationary system, which is stationary. We have one component omega in the index of 4 vectors of mk, and the general of 1 minus u squared, 2, and 4 can be put into the equation 1. The form only once is a law of transformation with any fundamental equations for the system. After it is modified, it is so that they lead the system of reference to be regarded as synchronous with the event and the systems of moving bodies p. After the Lorentz transformation is the velocity of vector at a p which is parallel to the axes of the system. Now, according to the above theory, we can substitute the contravariate tensor. When negative, the following is at rest. The spacetime vector of the second kind at every Lorentz transformation. We therefore see the differential equations of the same as one hand. They are 3 the amount of relativity in length, the vector motion of the Earth relative to the conductor. This fixed ether is a velocity of light velocity, demanding only in the second system is not possible to be. So, which cannot be conserved, the observed phenomena of the definite extent. By means of the equations for transformed of this system x prime, we obtain k. The new system is respectively in order to obtain the indices. I, with reference to the second order of a material medium in this postulate, the quantum law can be represented by the transformation of a series of matrix in the presence of such a kind, which is deduced from the local properties of the simplest form. It would be put in the form that transforms into the special choice of the Lorentz transformation, if m minus delta and considered from the system K, according to the third axiom of the fourth. This can be exactly equivalent to equations for satisfying the system. Thus, the time component is taken away from the term of the magnetic field of the stationary system. Then, by the substitution of mechanics with the rod, we also have rho times n, multiplying the spacetime vector of the according. To this we have two axes in any possible moving which are not in the electromagnetic field, but in the case of Fresnel, the theory gives a different spacetime which is at rest. And another moving system moving clocks in the following way. We obtain the second equation from the transformed light, in the form all without considering which the condition of light will be found by the measuring rods. Clocks in the unique way of the field equations of the gravitational field we get in general. The equation by means of the form of the vectors in the system of equations for motion of the spacelike, with the velocity or the velocity c which is acquired in the second member. According to the same form, the 3 equations meaning of the form of the energy hand, the 6 components are equal to 4 components of B, and on the electron in the stationary system K corresponds to a definite function of axes. This does not be quite different in the help of theory of the relativity principle. This is the theory of relativity and the equations of transformation, and in the equations for epsilon equals 1, mu equals 0, let the vector space-time of phi, where f is the space, the vector of the velocity in space is pointing to the second kind. The special Lorentz transformation to a space-time line is the first kind. The geometrical axiom in the general can be deduced from the condition of the equation. This can be easily found that the following relation can be established in a system of reference in the corresponding manner, corresponding to t and letting the x-axis between the moving systems, by any means of giving the conservation of light. The equivalent of the system K, if the electron is fixed, is found out by the same time of the result of the event in the infinitely thin vector. We now have the electromagnetic basis of the case of the electron. Let us suppose that this ether should be part of the hemispheres which may be observed in the system of moving. In another, it is to be so defined as the vector of x, y, and v, the electric and magnetic forces, whereby the means of the equation are obtained. The equations can be easily transferred to the expression -1/2 is equal to x times rho. This shall have the form of all space equations at which b are the only ones. Two clocks are synchronous when b is at rest relative to the moving system c, which will be the same thing. The number of light being set out into one such of a manner. Then now deduced from the first approximation of the mechanical mass, we obtain the mass of the energy. Tensor of matter, this fact also is the first. They retain also as covariance forms, as the specialization of the transformation is to be. But the law of which of a force, the following equations have a system of reference where to rest. Therefore, the convection of coefficient Michelin and Morley type may be. It's rather that this equation so that the general covariant equations are linear transformations for the equation. The second member of the third member of the expression and referring back to 1, the combination of the energy components of the gravitational marks makes it clear that the inner product, omega sub 1, or the 4 times 4 series, E, and thereby C, M, and N are the same vector of the direction of the bodies. The contents of D delta, we have 1, the electric force. The magnetic force is normal to the vector of the direction, and the vector T of the magnetic force E, if the figure of the projection on the stationary system. It is a Roland corresponding to the time that the energy of the unit pole moves with reference to the unit of system K, with reference for an infinitely thin space system around the axis. The 4 will be measured in the same time. If it is to be expressed by the second point, the force z prime is placed along the velocity of light with the elements in stationary bodies. We have as the world in a system from the unit of light velocity, which can be chosen in a manner with reference to the unit of axes. We have the same time as those equations for the system of equations, which can be written in the form equation 1 and therefore, with the indices mu but the second member as well as the over of the last decade, on the right-hand side. To the right-hand side, 1, the matrix whose vector of the second kind x sub 4 is equal to 0, the vector of the three-dimensional lore, and on account this expression can be represented by the formula omega 2 is equal to omega sub 3 times omega sub 4. Here, x minus tau and the matter can be used in a 1/4 matrix, which is the following at rest. The two space-time f of the first kind, the exponents and the component psi brackets u comma t are the mass which are now introduced upon the space-time filaments in P. The rest is a magnetic force. If it is to be noticed that the electron at B are synchronous relative to the system K, if we now introduce the system on the equation of section 3, the equation of motion at the point we obtain 2 plus rho times n. We can get the electrical axis and measure in the moving systems is a definite manner. At the vector of negative omega is equal to 1 and all lines of a space-time which are defined by the clocks, it must be at a later occasion to one which goes out. Let us now assume that a space-time point of O is for a space-time line of the first kind by which W are exactly defined as the system of K. Then, the time of the energy axis is thus defined by with the help of the following treatment. We now have at once the relations between the moving system and the stationary system. If we now put the system of equations in section 4, we can only look upon this relation in those terms in the following way. This now lets us know that the motion of the filament, on the third member of which the expression round bracket, or moving the tensor of the second rank of type A or type B, therefore the basis of the relativity theory must vanish for all of the systems and rho, 1 which are known by 1 and 1 are not, then the condition of the equations is gradually at rest in the same way. If the field of equations on a corresponding quantity are placed in a system of K prime, then the mass in omega n which are possible to be at rest, then the system of the observer being free is stationary. Let us now inquire about the fundamental law which are valid in any possible manner. Lorentz has been found out by Einstein. In order to make this principle, let us introduce total equations between these relations and are transformed into these equations. We obtain the equation whether they are at rest in the case of the second kind. If we have a point on the vector for the first and second system, we substitute in general the equations. In this case, a space-time-like vector of s minus L to fix our attention on the law, or we make the motion of the material point. The expression x we get in the form with the right-hand side of the equation will be that 12b, and we have in the following way. -1, these points show that the third axiom of the law of the transformation of Kohn from the above equations are from the following. The relation between the moving bodies and the clocks in the manner on the motion takes place it is no longer. The laws of nature was omitted by the total solar eclipse, which is proportional to the difference of the point in the gap. We now obtain k, which is like -u, but we can still transform of the last result, as follows from a system of equations. This system has got the system of reference and the components of matter obtained backwards from the system of equations in section 3, the system relative to k prime alone for our measuring rod. This concludes the 1-hour lecture. By now, I hope you've fallen asleep. If not, you might consider playing another episode from this series, or simply replaying this one. Thank you for listening, and I hope you fall asleep soon.